All right, so today we're just going to introduce the book of Revelation. I tried to, in this lesson, keep out any kind of real technical stuff and tried to make it just like bare bones. What is it you need to know the most about the book? Because Revelation is the most complicated book in the Bible. um, I entitled this A Final Word, A Story of Hope and Victory, because really that's what John's trying to set out. Is John wants us to grasp how this is God's final word spoken to people. This is the book that closed the canon, but it's a story of hope and victory. It's not a book that's meant to make us scared or disappointed or frustrated or any of that stuff. And that's unfortunately that's how it's been used a lot through the church, is to scare folks. And it's not. It's the exact opposite is supposed to be true. It's supposed to give hope to the church because God has set a day where Jesus will come back and God will right every wrong and He will complete what He started with Jesus 2,000 years ago. So it's a good book. It's a hopeful book. And that's what we'll see as we get into it. So here in the introduction, it says the book of introduction, or the Apocalypse of John, stands as a complex and profoundly symbolic text at the conclusion of the New Testament, offering a powerful vision of divine judgment, redemption, and ultimate cosmic renewal. Written during a period of intense persecution, likely under the Roman Empire during the late 1st century CE, this apocalyptic text emerged from the pen of John of Patmos as a message of hope and ultimate vindication for a marginalized Christian community facing systemic oppression. All right, so when we look at it, it's a really complicated book. It's full of symbols, full of images, and the whole point of it, though, is it's a vision of the end. It's a vision of when God comes to right those wrongs. And it's written to a church that's being persecuted. Remember, John is on an island, a prison island, that was owned by Rome, where they would send the worst offenders to basically be there and starve to death. It was just a terrible place. And John is there when he receives the vision, and according to the text is when he writes it, because he's writing it from Patmos. And so that's important. That'll come into the discussion a little bit later. But again, he's trying to encourage a church that's being systematically persecuted by the Roman government. Not just the Roman government, also other Jews are persecuting them as well. So this is the context that he's writing in. He's also, unlike historical narrative, or I should have put letters. Epistolary is letters. Revelation employs a rich tapestry of symbolic language, vivid imagery, and prophetic discourse to communicate its theological message. So John's being intentional when he writes this. He's using everything that he's using in a very intentional way to communicate a message. As the author himself declares in Revelation 1:3, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of the prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near." This opening statement reveals the text's dual purpose. So there's two things that he's trying to do: to provide spiritual encouragement and to articulate a divine perspective on contemporary challenges while simultaneously pointing toward a resolution in the future. And you get this in all the prophet works. We're going to see what kind of book is Revelation, because it has at least three main genres. Revelation starts off as a letter. I, John, write to you, the churches, grace and peace to you and all that stuff. So it's written, it begins as a letter. It's also a prophecy. It contains all the literary markers of being a prophecy, but then it's also an apocalypse. So it's a really complicated book. It'd be like opening up your newspaper and you read poetry, and then you read a letter from somebody, and then you read science fiction short story in it. You'd be like, what in the world am I reading? What is this? But he wants to encourage the church, and he wants to show them God's perspective in what they're going through in their persecution, but also show what God's going to do in the future. So that's going to be the big question, is where does the book stop being for the original churches, the 7 churches in Asia Minor, and when does it become a book for us for the future? That's going to be a big question as we get in, when we get into the study, and that's one of the things we're hoping to answer. The text is not merely a predictive prophecy about end-time events, but a nuanced theological work that reinterprets the biblical narrative through a lens of divine sovereignty. Okay, so what that means is John is purposely using the Old Testament. He's also purposely using the apocalyptic genre and prophetic literature to create his work. You know, this is one of the most skillful books put together. And again, that doesn't take away from the inerrancy and the infallibility of the Word of God. All we're saying is they wrote using what was available to them, and so you have to understand how it functions in their world in order to make sense of it for us. So John's very purposive. You know, he has a purpose in doing this. He wants to show God's sovereignty. By presenting a cosmic struggle between good and evil, John offers his audience a framework for understanding their present sufferings within a broader, ultimately triumphant divine plan. The dramatic imagery from the 4 horsemen to the great dragon, from the 7 seals to the New Jerusalem, serves not as literal description, but as powerful metaphorical language designed to inspire hope, encourage faithfulness, and provide spiritual perspective to a community under duress. One of the things I want to do for you is to show you, when we say that the images and the symbols and stuff are not to be taken literally, that doesn't mean that they're not true. But no one's looking for a beast with multiple heads to come out of the sea. We know that that is referring to a political power. Okay, so what I want to do is when people tell you they believe Revelation literally, I'm going to make pictures for you of what these creatures would look like in real life and say, nobody believes in that. But I want to give that to you because those are images that John wants in our head, because every part of it is important to the picture he's trying to paint of who these people and these entities are. And so it's helpful to have those illustrations in front of you, because again, we're not looking for the prostitute on the back of a 10-headed beast to come. We're looking at real people who are going to fulfill these roles. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. This literary study will explore how John's apocalyptic work functions as both a critique of contemporary imperial power and a profound theological statement about divine justice, redemption, and the ultimate restoration of creation. And so again, you have to keep that in mind. John's criticizing both Rome and Israel in that book. Okay? And so he's criticizing the powers that be of his day, and using that as a platform to talk about what God's going to do in the future. Okay? And so that's important, because all apocalyptic literature, whether it's Revelation, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, or if it's maybe like the other ones like Enoch and all of those apocryphal works, they were all written to critique people who were alive then. Okay? So the symbols and the imagery, part of the reason for using it was to hide who you're talking about. So only those in the know would know who you're talking about, and so that'll come up in the text. Like the beast, that was a name for Nero. That was a nickname that everybody had for Nero. And in his garden parties, he'd wear animal skins and he would crawl through, he would have Christians burning as human torches in his garden parties, and he would maul Christian prisoners and kill them in front of the other Romans. and he was insane. That's why they called him the beast. So you'll have a lot of that in the book where he's focused on these worldly powers and this symbolism and imagery of people who were alive then that he's criticizing while he's still focused on what God's going to do in the future. None of these people are going to stop God, right? That's the big thing. God will bring justice, redemption, and restore the creation. Okay, by analyzing it, this is the last sentence in this paragraph. By analyzing its symbolic language, historical context, and theological depth, we can appreciate Revelation not as an obscure or frightening text, but as a sophisticated piece of prophetic literature that speaks to universal human experiences of suffering, hope, and ultimate meaning. Okay, so again, I just really want to emphasize that it's not a book meant to frighten us. It's a book meant to give us hope and encouragement and make sense of the world that we live in. All right, so we're going to look at the author. This is big for a reason. It's to give you a lot of information, but it is important. The author of Revelation identifies, this is top of page 2. The author of Revelation identifies himself as John in several places, and there I listed you all the scripture verses, Revelation 1:1, Revelation 1:4, Revelation 1:9, Revelation 22:8. He also calls himself a servant of God in the first verse there, and a brother to the churches he was writing to in verse 9 of the first chapter. But beyond that, there are no references that make it explicit which John we are talking about. Tradition has strongly supported John the Apostle, brother of James, son of Zebedee, and one of Jesus' 12 disciples. So that's the John that most people think of. Early Christian writers such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, all writing sometime in the 2nd century, affirm this view. All right. So also John's residence, John lived in Ephesus. Remember, he was there. He had Mary there. That's where a lot of people believe that Mary was buried. Mary was buried in Ephesus. And remember, John was supposed to take care of Mary for Jesus, acting as the firstborn son. Jesus made that happen from the cross. And so that's where they went to. Mary and John went to Ephesus, and John, he died there, was buried there. And he was exiled to Patmos. He was actually exiled to Patmos twice. Not just once, twice. John was exiled to Patmos. And that's all consistent with what we know about John. Okay? So many who hold this view also cite theological consistency with John, the beloved disciple. So in other words, if you compare Revelation, the Gospel of John, and John's letters, you see that most likely it's the same person writing those books. His writing, a lot of his style comes through. His main thing is the way he talks about God. He references Jesus. All of that stuff would really point to John the Apostle. Many of the themes found in John's Gospel and epistles are echoed in Revelation. However, some have strongly argued that differences in language and writing style between Revelation and John's Gospel make it difficult to accept his authorship. Okay, so others say, well, if you look at it from purely a literary viewpoint, okay, so Pete writes an article for the newspaper. Pete writes a letter to, a great-grandchild, and Pete types up a business for trustees and treasurers reports. You could compare those and tell, well, the same guy wrote these. His style, you could tell it's the same person. Well, according to some authors, if you lay them all down and look at the literary style, they don't line up. John and the epistles are the same, but the Revelation is different. Okay, so the next paragraph we're looking at, what are the alternatives? So alternatives to the traditional view has been put forward. As early as the 3rd century, so that's the 200s, Christian writers such as Papias and Eusebius of Caesarea suggested that a figure known as John the Elder was responsible for the revelation. This person is thought to be distinct from John the Apostle. John the Elder may have been a prominent Christian leader in Asia Minor, which agrees with the setting of Revelation, the 7 churches that are mentioned in chapters 2 and 3. They're all in Asia Minor. Others argue for a different John, an unknown Christian prophet not associated with the apostle or the elder. The reason for this is because of the differences in Greek grammar and vocabulary between Revelation and the Gospel of John. The Greek in John's Gospel and letters is a more polished Greek than in Revelation, which is often described as ungrammatical or Semitic Greek. This is a kind of Greek that's heavily influenced by Hebrew or Aramaic thought patterns. Okay, so the idea is, like, if you learned Spanish in high school, and you retained a good bit of it, but you go to Spain or Mexico and you start conversing with someone who's fluent in it, you're going to speak an English version of their language. You're not going to speak actual Spanish, or it takes years of discipline and you have to think like a Mexican or think like a Spanish-speaking person, someone from Spain, in order to speak fluently like they do.
Probably something that influenced your life to start with.
Yeah, and so you'll speak an English form of it, and it'll be a little confusing, but you'll be able to communicate with them. This is kind of the same thing that's happening here. In this, the Greek's not polished; it's very basic, and there's a lot of Jewish isms in it, so that it's not like a pure Greek text. It's Greek, it's all in the Greek, but it's the way that an uneducated Jewish person writing in Greek would write, okay? So that's why they say it's not the same person, because the Gospels and the epistles are good Greek. So how in the world could this be the same person? All right? So also the highly symbolic and apocalyptic style may indicate a unique prophetic voice independent of other Johannine literature. So in other words, you don't see this kind of writing in John's Gospel. You don't see it in his epistles. It's not typical of him to write like this. And so that makes people say, well, that just doesn't seem like the same person. So these differences have led some to question common authorship, while others attribute the variations to the different purposes and contexts of the works. This is where I am, okay? One reason for the differences, this is my opinion, could be that John used a secretary to write the gospel and the epistles, and John wrote Revelation himself. Okay, that would make perfect sense of what we know about John. Remember, when John and Peter were before the Sanhedrin, it said that they recognized that they were uneducated men, unlearned men. And but John actually had more education than the typical Jew, because remember, his dad had a fleet of ships, so he must have been a little more wealthier of the fishermen. And John had connections in the temple. John and Jesus went to the temple. John went right in, according to the Gospel of John. He knew people. He knew the high priest. He knew some of the priesthood. So that would say that John probably had more education than the standard, Jewish, normal Jewish upbringing. And so my belief is that John wrote the Revelation while he was on Patmos, because he says he did, and that what we're seeing in the differences is actually because he didn't have a secretary writing for him. Paul used a secretary, Peter used a secretary. That was pretty typical for the Jewish writers of Scripture of the New Testament, is to use secretaries. So that would make perfect sense. Okay?
Paul indicated he did.
Yeah, Paul used secretaries, and he would just sign the letters.
Well, in some of the books he actually said, I actually wrote this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he only signed his name in the letters. That's all he would do. But he used an amanuensis. I can never say that word right. But it's a secretary for writing, their letters. All right, so that's my opinion, is that and then also another reason John could have chose the style he used in Revelation because of the content of the book itself. Okay, so this was the best literary method that he wanted to use to write it, so that explains why it's different too. So there's perfectly reasonable answers of why it's different. All right, so the historical context, what's going on? So Revelation was most likely written during the time of Roman persecution of Christians. If this is the case, it was most likely under Emperor Nero from 54 to 68 AD or Emperor Domitian, 81 to 96 AD. The latter date is more commonly accepted, but it is just as likely that the earlier dating is the real dating. My personal opinion is that John wrote his Revelation prior to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The author was writing in exile on the island of Patmos, a prison island belonging to Rome, and was addressing the spiritual and social challenges facing the churches in Asia Minor. Okay, so you get that. Nero was the emperor between 54 and 68 AD. That was one of the imprisonments of John on the island of Patmos, and it makes more sense with all the data. Okay, the fact that the number 666 in both Hebrew and Greek spell out Nero, it spells out Caesar Nero. That it's mentioned the beast would be Emperor Nero because that was his nickname. And that was one of John's stays on the island of Patmos, and that was prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it makes a lot more sense. Out of any possible timeline, that's the one that makes the most sense. Emperor Domitian, and much later, again, John was in prison then too. But that date of writing, there's more speculation around that, and it doesn't line up with what we also know about the book of Revelation itself. But those are the two regularly cited possible dating that most scholarship points to. Okay. Now it served as an apocalyptic text predicting end times events and offering hope to persecuted Christians. So that's the historical context. That's what John's doing. Now, the next section is important. The purpose for writing. What's John writing about? So no matter who wrote the book, its central purpose is clear. Again, I believe it's John the Apostle. I have no doubt that's who it is. John was seeking to encourage Christians who were facing the persecution of Rome. He used symbolism to address contemporary political and spiritual challenges facing the early church, and he used the apocalyptic genre to communicate profound theological truths. All right, so again, it served his purposes best to use this particular style of writing that was very popular in the first century to communicate to the church what he wanted them to know, what God wanted them to know. Okay? He also sought to affirm the sovereignty of Christ and God's ultimate victory over evil and the renewal of creation. And this is where we have to really pay attention to this book, because it keeps emphasizing that Jesus is the dominating power. Nothing else even comes near. Okay, and that God's going to be bringing his judgment. Finally, he wanted to call the church to faithfulness in the face of oppressive tribulations and circumstances. Okay, again, you have believers who are tempted to flee and run, go away because they're being persecuted. Like I said, the emperor was using them, burning their bodies for garden parties. They put them in the arena and had them fight wild animals for entertainment for Rome. They were systematically persecuted throughout the first 3 centuries by the Roman government until finally in 325 AD, the emperor made it and accepted, and actually the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it is because by then the church had won so many people to faith in Christ that there was more Christians than non-Christians in the Roman Empire. So again, it was never intended to be a book to instill fear, but rather hope in God's power, control, and judgment during historical tribulations. He was offering a prophetic perspective that transcends immediate historical circumstances. All right, so the book of Revelation is bigger than just John and his immediate context. There's a reason why it comes at the end of the canon, is because it is the completion of all of God's purposes. So that's important as well. All right, interpretation. How have people read it? We're actually almost done. There's only a couple more paragraphs after this. Revelation has been interpreted in various different ways. 4 primary views, though, have been held throughout church history. The preterist view sees the majority of the prophecy fulfilled in the coming of Christ in the early church. So, according to the preterist view, most of the book is already completed. You only have the last few chapters that need to happen. 21, 22, mostly, are the only ones that aren't fulfilled. Now, this is due to the idea that what most of Revelation was prophesying was the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The futurist view sees everything after the 7 churches in chapters 2 through 3 as in the future for us. So that's what you've always been taught, is the futurist view. Okay. So the idealist, now the next 2 you've probably never heard of at all. Most people never have. The idealist view believes that Revelation is a timeless allegory of the battle between good and evil. This would make it relevant for every generation. So, in other words, you can apply it to any time there is an oppressive government that is persecuting God's people. You draw wisdom from this book because this is what you do in those circumstances. Okay, so that's what that view understands, is that it can apply to anybody. And there's reasons for that, good reasons for that, but I don't believe that that's the proper view. The historicist sees Revelation as a symbolic history of the church. You may or may not have been introduced to this or not. A famous example of this is St. Augustine. St. Augustine believed that the different churches in Revelation were symbols of the church ages. So the early church, was the very first church that you read about. That was that church. And then each church is a different church age up until God, until Jesus Christ comes back. And that was a pretty popular view for a long time until the Protestant Reformation. And even some of the Protestant reformers believed that. John Calvin had a historicist view of how the church is being designated eras of the church age, however many hundreds of years. The problem is it does not work out well. There's no way that that's a proper view of Revelation. My own personal view is a preterist view. That's the preterist and the futurist are the most common. But which one do you think is the largest held view in the church today? A futurist or a preterist view? Remember, a preterist thinks most of Revelation is fulfilled. There's only a couple chapters that have yet to be done. And the other is the futurist, the one that you were taught growing up. Which do you think is the largest view? What most Christians hold in the world? Yeah.
Still, a lot of people think it's way in the future.
Nope.
No?
That's actually the minority position.
Is that right?
Most of the church in the world, most denominations that affirm a belief, a particular view of the future, the majority, vast majority, is preterist, because most churches adopt an amillennial view, and an amillennial is preterist. Like, for instance, the whole Catholic Church, their dogma is you have to believe all millennial or you're not going to heaven. It's part of their dogma. We don't do that. No Protestant denomination makes it your dogma. You're free to believe what you want about the future, as long as you believe that what God has promised that has to be done yet is still to be done. But most people think it is futurist because it's popular in the United States, but it's only popular in the United States. Most nations don't really have anybody, unless a missionary brings it in, they don't hold that view. Most are all millennialists, which is somebody who believes that that the millennial reign of Jesus Christ is right now, and that we're waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. So, and that's actually the growing option in the Church of the Nazarene. It's more and more people are leaving the futurist and becoming all millennialists. My view is the smallest one, so I'm a post-millennialist, which means I believe that the Christian church is going to continue to grow and grow and grow until when Jesus returns, it's to a world that's mostly Christian. And so for me, that explains the long wait for Jesus to come back. Why he hasn't come back yet is because he's waiting for the church to do the mission of God in the world. And we're going to talk about that as we go. I'm not putting any particular view in this study. We're doing a literary study to see what does John say and what do we learn from that. So I'm not putting out a particular view. Okay.
You often wonder how much longer he can put up with people.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, you have to also remember.
That he loves them throughout
Yeah,
eternity.
yeah. You have to remember too, though, that the church has grown more in the last 100 years than in the first 1900 years of its existence. The church is actually doing a better job than what people realize. We're just experiencing decline in the U.S. because Christianity has declined in the West. But everywhere else, it's growing like crazy. So the church is doing better now than it ever has. It's working on the mission of God better now than ever. So we have to think globally, not locally. Because when we look locally, then you say, "Oh no, it's bad news. Things are getting worse and worse and worse." Well, you go and tell that to the places in the South America, Africa, places in Asia where it's booming and it's growing in ways that it never did before. They're experiencing revival, and so you can't judge the future based on our context. You have to look globally at what God's doing, and the church is doing very well. It's growing more than it ever has, faster than it ever has. You have to remember there's I can't remember the exact number now, but Christianity is still, by a large margin, the biggest religion in the world. There's more adherents to it all over the world than any other religion. So
It seems like, though, you hear more and more in the United States, too, as far as on the news or anything, but I don't know when the last time I heard much about Christ like we are this year.
Well, no, that's the thing. We're an apostate nation. We're in apostasy. We're in apostasy. England's in apostasy. The whole West and Canada, but all over the world, it's growing like crazy, and God's doing great things. And one of the things they say is eventually, within probably my lifetime, China's going to be a free country because the rate of Christian growth in that country is getting to the point it's almost where they're going to start tipping over the scales where it's more Christian than communism. And eventually it's just going to become a Christian nation. And it's because of the rapid growth of the church there. And again, you have to remember that the greatest work that's happened over there, where now you have millions and millions and millions of Christians there, has occurred in the last 100 years. That massive growth where you have millions and millions of Christians, and it's double digits. I can't remember the exact number. It's huge. But it's getting to the tipping point that almost half the nation is because it's six figures, millions, hundreds of millions of Christians. That's all been in the last 100 years. That's fast. When you look at the growth of the church before that, it was very slow. Mm-hmm. So yeah, again, you cannot judge, you cannot read Revelation based on America. You have to look globally at what God's doing, and the church is doing better than it ever has in its existence. It's just you're not going to hear it in our country because they're not going to report what God's doing in other countries on our media. That's why you have to know missionaries, and you have to read missionary periodicals and things like that and see how the church is growing like crazy elsewhere. And then you say, okay, yeah, God's doing a great thing in the world, and the church is doing really, really well. Okay, but yeah, my view isn't a unique view, actually. John and Charles Wesley were preterists. The early Methodists were all preterists, all the way up until the 1900s. all the holiness churches were all preterists. There was no such thing as futurists in the Methodists at all, in all the holiness churches. They were all preterists. And the Puritans who settled our country, Puritans and Pilgrims, they were all preterists. So again, I just put that in there because when I start talking about my view of the future, a lot of people are like, well, I've never heard of that before. And I'm like, actually, it's one of the oldest views out in church history. It's just the churches have not been instructed well in church history and, in all other views than what they've been told, so that's a problem. And I can't do that. I will never put my position out there as this is the one you have to believe. That's why I like doing a literary study, because we're looking at what is John saying, what's the symbols he's using, what does that reference to, and then you make up your own opinion from there. Okay. All right, so the literary structure, we're almost done. The literary structure, this is important as well, because when you see how a writer structures their work, that's telling you something. Now, I gave you the most basic, bare minimum, 5-point, general outline possible. When we get into the study, it's going to be a lot more detailed. But why I like real simple ones is it helps you, if you can memorize those 5 things or reword them however for yourself, it helps you know where stuff's in a Bible book. So if you can remember a basic outline of a Bible book, when you're trying to remember where something's located to go back and look for it again, it makes it a lot easier when you say, oh, well, Luke, that comes in Luke's travel section, that big journey to Jerusalem section. That's chapters 9 through 19. So it's in there somewhere. It's a lot better than trying to look through the entire book of Luke, trying to locate something. If you can remember where something's located at, in a big outline. But the outline communicates. That's a part of the writer's message too, how they put the book together. So in this general outline, I kind of broke it down for you to let you know what these sections are going to deal with. In chapters 1 through 3, Revelation will establish John's apostolic authority, address specific challenges in the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and provide a prophetic critique and encouragement for the early Christian communities. It will also demonstrate Christ's sovereignty over historical challenges, emphasize divine judgment and redemption, and emphasize the importance of faithfulness under persecution. So all of that is going to be under the first 3 chapters. Chapters 4 through 5, John will reveal God's ultimate cosmic governance, meaning he rules over everything, demonstrate Christ's unique redemptive role, and establish divine control over historical events. In chapters 6 through 16, the longest section, the author will demonstrate the prophetic intention of Revelation in exposing systemic evil's destructive nature, demonstrate divine justice, and reveal the cosmic dimensions of spiritual warfare. I know that's really dense, but I'm trying to condense 10 chapters into a sentence. So it's if I don't use those kinds of words, that would be a paragraph itself. The point is these are all the judgments. This is the wrath of God being poured out on an antichrist government, and all that means for us. So it's God emphasizing his justice and showing us that the evil is global. It's everywhere, and that it's not just human agents involved. There's demonic powers that are involved. So that's all going to fall in those chapters 6 through 16. There is a clear progression of judgments in this section with 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, and escalating divine interventions throughout the narrative. So God keeps stepping in through angel mediators, and he executes his justice on these nations. In chapters 17 through 19, the author will reveal his goals, which are to expose political and spiritual powers opposing God, to prophesy the ultimate defeat of anti-God forces, and to provide hope through God's ultimate victory over all evil. And then the last 3 chapters, 20 through 22, that end Revelation serve as a conclusion. Here, the author will reveal the final triumph of God's kingdom, demonstrate a complete redemption of the entire cosmos, and provide God's promises concerning its ultimate restoration and renewal. Okay, so that's the final, everything's dealt with. Satan and all the forces of darkness will be destroyed. Sin is gone. God takes what's here, makes a new heaven, a new earth, restores everything. And then again, the end is not heaven. The end is here. Heaven comes to earth. Heaven and earth are back together because they were broken apart all the way back in Genesis 3. When Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the day, that was God's presence here on earth. And then God's presence vacated because of Adam and Eve's sin. And so now Revelation is the rejoining of heaven and earth for all eternity. Now the conclusion on page 4 is just these last few, this last paragraph here. Through this literary analysis, we will see how Revelation transcends simplistic apocalyptic predictions, instead offering a sophisticated theological narrative of divine sovereignty and hope. Again, that's my problem when people use this book to cherry pick verses to prove what they want to prove about the future. That's my problem. Okay? That's not how you use Scripture. That's what Satan does. Satan twists Scripture to make it say what he wants it to say. Oh, haven't you ever read in the Scriptures? Throw yourself down. Have you read in the Scriptures? The angels won't let you strike your foot against a stone. And Jesus says, I'm not testing God. He's seen right through it. Said, no, I'm not testing God. As John himself testifies in Revelation 21:5, see, I am making all things new, a declaration that encapsulates the text's core message of ultimate restoration and divine triumph. By exploring the intricate symbolic landscape of Revelation, we will uncover its profound spiritual and literary significance, revealing how this ancient text continues to speak powerfully to human experiences of struggle, faith, and redemptive transformation. That's really complicated, but the point is that ultimately God's gonna win. He's gonna fix everything, but we have to grapple with all of the images and all the stuff to really understand what God's doing. We have to really comprehend it. And as we get into the first lesson, one of the things I want to emphasize is it's called Revelation for a reason. A revelation is a revealing. It's taking something that was hidden and making it understood. Okay? So it's meant to be an understandable book. And you're interpreting it wrong when it's confusing. It shouldn't be confusing. John wouldn't have written a book that nobody can understand. God's not going to inspire a book that nobody's going to understand. All the mysteries in the Bible are always an unveiling, and they're always meant so that God's people understand. And that's what I want. That's what I hope to do, is help everybody understand what these symbols mean, how they fit in, to God's purposes, and what that means for us for the future. Okay, so we're going to look at all of these pieces next week. Again, it's this one, John's prologue. It's Revelation 1 through 8. We're going to look at the first 8 verses are the first literary unit, and we're going to focus on what John wants the readers to know. These are important. A prologue is important because everything that the writer is going to talk about in their letter or in any of the books, it starts in the beginning. They introduce major themes that they're going to talk about through the rest of the book. Whether you pick one of Paul's letters and read that, it's the same for Paul. All of his introductions, he's telling you what he's going to talk about later in the book at the very beginning. But even you go back to Genesis, and it begins, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it starts talking about creation. You're talking about divine origins, and the rest of the book is going to talk about origins, where everything comes from and who the nation of Israel is. But it's every single book in the Bible. For instance, the book of Psalms opens up with 2 introductions, chapter 1 and chapter 2. Those are both introductions to everything that the Psalms are going to talk about throughout the rest of the book of Psalms. So this is all like, I get geeked out on this stuff. I know not, other people don't find it as interesting as I do, but John's prologue is going to introduce everything. It's the book of Revelation in a nutshell. You know, it's a really, really good book here, a really good lesson that we're going to get into. So yeah, we're going to talk about the title and the purpose of Revelation. We're going to talk about the greetings and doxology John gives, and then we're going to talk about the declaration that is made, and it's 5 pages, and it's all big font. So I do that as much for me as anybody else.
It's easier.
Yeah, it's hard to follow text if it's too small. All right, so any questions about what we went over today?
Interesting.
Yeah, this stuff, sometimes it seems boring, but it's really important to understand context of a letter. It does change the meaning. If it's, you know, depending on their context, when they're writing, what they're writing about, you know, sometimes you know, I don't know, if you read biographies and stuff like that, you realize how different we are from people from other ages. And and part of understanding the books of the Bible is getting in the writer's head. What was going on in the life of John that he needed to write this. And then once you get inside his headspace, it's like a lot of things make a lot more sense than they did before you knew that information. You know, so that stuff's always important. Every Bible study of a book, if you read Bible study literature, if you read commentaries, things like that, they always start with an introduction for that reason. You need to know what's going on before you get into it. It makes you a better reader. It helps you better understand what you're going to read. And this lesson and the next one will really help us understand better what God's trying to do in this book. And it's going to be fun.
What do you think? It's too quiet.
All right, well, we'll conclude with a word of prayer then, and that will conclude the Bible study. I knew this was going to be a short one. I actually spent a lot more time in it than I intended to, but I was watching how the time didn't go past, it was going past very slowly. When I looked down, I was like, oh my goodness. So we have time to talk about this stuff. All right, let's pray.